Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
You ever walk into a room and feel like your very existence makes people uncomfortable? That was me at my cousin Derek's engagement party, and believe me, I didn't wear black to make a statement or brood in the corner like some bitter spinster from a Tennessee Williams play. I wore it because it was the only thing in my closet that didn't scream, "I'm trying to impress you." It was comfortable, it was clean, and it said what I wanted it to. I am here because I was invited, not because I care. The whole event was staged like some Pinterest fever dream. Rustic barn lights dangling over a pristine lawn, mason jars filled with artificial peonies, a white tent the size of an airplane hangar, and a playlist filled with country pop hits that made me want to claw at my eardrums. There were photo booths, signature cocktails named after the couple, Derek's old-fashioned ego, and Stacy's blushing bride, if you can believe it, and enough pastel pink decor to make you nauseous if you stared too long. I stood near the bar, nursing a drink that tasted like melted lipstick and vodka, doing my best to blend into the background while silently counting how many people were staring at me, probably wondering why I didn't bring a plus one, or if the rumors were true that I had more cats than dates in the past year. Then came Derek. Loud, confident, smiling that same crooked smirk he used to flash when he'd steal my Halloween candy as a kid and tell Grandma I gave it to him. He had always been like that, performative, charming in a greasy kind of way, like a discount game show host you couldn't quite trust. He strutted over to me with his drink in hand, Stacy's diamond flashing obnoxiously behind him like a lighthouse warning of incoming disaster. And then he said it. With the same snide tone he'd used our whole lives, when I didn't go to prom, when I chose accounting over communications, when I bought my first duplex instead of a designer handbag, he leaned in, just loud enough for those standing nearby to hear, and said, "It's cute how you still live alone with cats." Cute. It hit me in the chest like a sucker punch wrapped in a smile. Not because it was mean, it was nothing new, but because it was so calculated. He knew exactly what he was doing, exactly who was listening. Behind him stood Aunt Marie, sipping her wine with her pinky out like she was auditioning for an imaginary tea party, and Uncle Ted, nodding along like a bobblehead with a superiority complex. They never missed a chance to remind me that I hadn't settled down, or started a family, or joined the human race, as Uncle Ted once phrased it after too much whiskey. And I might have let it slide, I might have just smiled, nodded, and let Derek bask in his own smugness like always, but before I could open my mouth, before I could even think of a response, Grandma Lois, who'd been standing no more than 5 feet away with her cane in one hand and a whiskey sour in the other, turned around so sharply you'd think she'd been waiting for the cue. She looked straight at Derek, gave him one of those narrowed, squinting looks she'd perfected over decades of being the only person in the family who said what everyone else was thinking, and said, "Is that before or after she closed on her third property?" There was a sound that came next, this collective pause, like the whole tent took a breath at the same time and forgot how to let it out. Derek's mouth stayed open for a second too long. Someone behind me dropped a fork. I heard a bridesmaid giggle and then immediately pretend she hadn't. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I just looked at Derek, gave him the same fake smile I'd practiced in family photos for years, and took another sip of that god-awful drink. And in that moment, just for a second, I saw something in Derek's eyes I'd never seen before. Not pity. Not superiority. Not even confusion. I saw fear. Because the thing about people like Derek is they only feel big when they think you're small. And he had just learned, in front of everyone he ever wanted to impress, that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the joke he'd always assumed. But let's back up for a second, because that moment didn't just happen out of nowhere. That crack in his armor, that hesitation, that stammer, it was years in the making. This wasn't about cats or real estate or who wore what to a family function. This was about a lifetime of being underestimated, of playing quiet when I could have shouted, of letting them think they were winning while I quietly built a life that didn't need their approval. What stung most wasn't the comment, it was that he still saw me that way. After everything. After all the years and the holidays and the silent side eyes and whispered comments when I walked into the room alone. He still believed I was beneath him. And maybe I had let him think that for too long. But not anymore. Because that night, something shifted. It wasn't just Grandma's comment or the way the room froze afterward. It was the realization that I didn't have to play small to make them comfortable anymore. I didn't owe Derek silence. I didn't owe this family an explanation. And most importantly, I wasn't done. You ever have that moment where someone tries to humiliate you and instead they hand you a match and stand there soaking in gasoline? Well, I had just found the match. And the night wasn't over yet. You know, the kind of silence that doesn't feel like peace, but more like an accusation you can't quite name? That's the kind of silence that filled my childhood every time I walked into a room full of family and sat down without speaking first. The kind that made you feel like you had something to prove simply by existing. That silence followed me into adulthood, molded itself into sidelong glances at Thanksgiving dinners, fake smiled compliments wrapped in pity, and those subtle questions like, "Still single?" or "Any news in the love life department?" Followed by quick reassurances like, "It's okay, sweetheart, you've always been independent," as if independence was a consolation prize for not being chosen. The truth is, people like me aren't supposed to win. Not in families like mine. We're supposed to fade quietly into the background, make polite conversation, bring deviled eggs to potlucks, and nod along when someone's son gets promoted for the third time in 2 years, even when everyone knows it's because his dad's golf buddy is the CEO. We're supposed to show up, shut up, and never shine too bright, especially if our kind of success doesn't fit neatly into their box of what a woman should want by 40. Derek was always the prototype of what they wanted to see succeed: loud, charming, utterly shallow, but with just enough fake humility to make people forget how empty his words were. I remember sitting at family barbecues, listening to him spin stories about his latest business ventures, his near deals, his almost successes, all while sipping beers he didn't pay for and flirting with waitresses who were too young to know better. He made mediocrity look shiny, like wrapping a used tire in a bow and calling it a gift. And they ate it up. Especially Aunt Marie, who never missed an opportunity to announce his arrival like he was royalty stepping into a room full of peasants. "Oh, look who's here, Derek. Just closed another deal." "So proud," she'd say, while I stood 3 feet away, listening quietly, always holding back from saying, "Did you know he defaulted on a loan last month?" or "He owes back taxes on his LLC." But I never did. I kept my wins private, my mouth shut, and my smile tight. It wasn't that I was ashamed of what I'd built, it's that I knew deep down they didn't want to hear about it. Not really. A woman doing well on her own, without a husband, without a wedding registry, without baby shower invitations and smiling Christmas cards pinned to the fridge, that made people uncomfortable. That made people question their choices. And no one likes to feel like maybe they didn't pick the right path, especially when they've been walking it so loudly for so long. I remember the first time I felt the shift, the first time I realized I was building something real, something mine, and that no one in my family would ever truly understand it. It was 4 years ago, right after I closed on my second property, a duplex in a quiet suburb with good schools and low crime rates. I'd spent 2 years saving, cutting expenses, fixing my credit, and watching the market like it was a game of chess. I stayed in when others went out. I passed on vacations, I taught myself about leverage and rental yields, and I made damn sure every move I made had a purpose. And when I finally signed those papers and held those keys in my hand, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, not pride exactly, but control. Like I was no longer waiting for life to happen to me. I was building it, brick by brick. When I mentioned it at a family dinner, casually, in response to one of Uncle Ted's rants about how millennials don't know how to invest in real assets, the room went quiet. Not the good kind of quiet. The suspicious kind. Aunt Marie blinked like I'd spoken in Greek. Derek laughed and said something about how landlording isn't a real job and that property values are a bubble anyway. I remember Grandma Lois looking at me over her glasses, not saying a word, just watching. She was the only one who didn't seem surprised. From that moment on, I stopped bringing up my work, my properties, my tenants, my renovations. I stopped mentioning the long nights spent dealing with plumbing issues, the calls from panicked renters, the thrill of finding a hidden gem of a fixer-upper and making it shine again. I let them believe I was just floating along, cats and all, because it was easier than explaining what they refused to hear. They didn't see the early mornings spent poring over spreadsheets or the weekends spent painting and scrubbing and staging open houses. They didn't see the risk, the stress, the quiet victories. And they didn't ask. They preferred the version of me they could pity. But here's the thing about building in silence, it gives you time. Time to grow, to strategize, to stay 10 steps ahead while everyone else is too busy performing their success to see the floors about to collapse beneath them. People like me, we don't get parades. We don't get applause. We get smirks and whispers and raised eyebrows, and we keep going anyway. Because we know that real power doesn't need to shout. So when Derek made that little comment at his party, so smug, so casual, so calculated, it didn't really surprise me. That was who he'd always been. But what did surprise me, even in that moment, was how little it stung. It didn't feel like a punch in the gut. It felt like a reminder. A reminder of how far I'd come, and how far behind he still was, no matter how many spotlights he stood under. And the funny thing is, that night, when Grandma spoke up and turned the whole room on its head, it wasn't even the moment I planned to take my shot. I hadn't come there to start a war. But as I stood there, watching Derek's face tighten, his grip on his glass shift, the glances ricochet around the room like ping-pong balls of tension, I realized something else. I wasn't angry anymore. I was ready. And the game had only just begun. It's a strange kind of irony that the people who talk the loudest about their accomplishments often have the least to show when the curtains are pulled back, when the bright lights dim and the smoke clears, revealing not a grand structure of success, but a flimsy cardboard cutout held up by ego, borrowed money, and carefully curated lies. Derek was the kind of man who built his image like a stage set, just convincing enough from a distance, perfectly arranged for social media, polished up for dinner parties, and padded with just enough half-truths to pass as confidence. At least to those too polite or too blind to look beneath the surface. But if you stayed long enough to hear the creaking floorboards, to notice how the walls didn't quite meet the ceiling, it became obvious that behind that winning grin and designer suit was a man who had never really stood on his own 2 feet. A man who confused confidence with capability and mistook approval for achievement. I knew this not because I had some vendetta or chip on my shoulder, but because I watched him operate up close for years, and I saw the patterns before anyone else dared to notice them. Derek, bless his heart, wasn't a criminal in the legal sense. He didn't rob banks or run Ponzi schemes, but he was, in every practical way, a scam artist of the highest order. He borrowed big, promised bigger, and delivered just enough to avoid suspicion. His success, such as it was, came not from skill or insight, but from his ability to talk fast, flatter strategically, and retreat before the consequences could catch up. The family thought he was a genius, a natural-born deal-maker, a young hustler with the Midas touch, when in truth, all he had was charisma, a revolving line of credit, and no conscience when it came to bending the truth until it screamed. That night at the engagement party, after Grandma's bombshell dropped and the atmosphere grew heavy with tension, I took a little walk around the edge of the tent, partly to get away from the plastic smiles and clinking glasses, and partly because I needed to think through what came next. I hadn't planned to embarrass Derek, not publicly, not yet. But when the universe hands you a moment on a silver platter, when the stage sets itself and the audience is seated, sometimes the only thing left to do is decide which curtain to pull first. I ended up near the back patio, just beyond the crowd, where a small group of Derek's business friends had gathered, their voices low, their posture relaxed in that overly confident way men have when they think no one important is listening. I wasn't eavesdropping, not at first, but the tone of their voices caught my attention, laughing, fast-talking, laced with that greedy edge I knew too well from years in real estate circles. They were talking numbers, flipping contracts, short-term returns, and then one of them, some guy named Jordan, who looked like a hedge fund banker cosplaying as a cowboy, leaned in close to Derek and muttered something about that under-the-table refinance. And Derek, without even lowering his voice, started bragging about how he'd convinced a private lender to inflate the appraisal on a commercial property by almost 20%, just to pull out equity and funnel it into another deal he didn't have the capital to actually close. I stood there, still as a statue, barely breathing, not because I was surprised, but because I was stunned at how sloppy he'd become. That kind of arrogance, that belief that the world will never catch you because it never has, that's when men like Derek make mistakes. Big ones. And if I'd been holding on to any doubt that he deserved what was coming, that moment burned it out of me like a wildfire through dry timber. Because it wasn't just about me anymore, it wasn't just the years of ridicule, or the way he made me feel like less every time I walked into a room. It was that he was dangerous, reckless, and entirely unwilling to take responsibility for the wake of damage he left behind. I walked back into that party with a decision already forming in my mind, not fully shaped yet, but simmering with intent. I wasn't going to expose him right there, not in a way that could be dismissed as petty family drama or jealousy, as Aunt Marie would no doubt label it. No, this had to be done with precision, with care, and most importantly, with restraint. Because real revenge isn't about the moment, it's about the aftermath. It's about watching someone who thought they were untouchable start to question every shadow, every silence, every smile that might mean something more. And make no mistake, I had more than enough ammunition. Derek didn't know it, but one of the lenders he bragged about manipulating, I had worked with them 2 years ago on a distressed property deal. I knew their underwriting team. I knew exactly how they'd respond to whispers about appraisal fraud. And the commercial building he mentioned? I recognized the address. He didn't know that, of course, because he never saw me as someone who might move in the same circles. But I did. Quietly, deliberately, I'd carved out a space in a world he thought was his alone, and now I was one phone call away from pulling that rug right out from under him. But that wasn't even the best part. The best part was that, unlike Derek, I didn't need to brag. I didn't need to make a scene. All I had to do was wait, plant the seed, and let him water it with his own arrogance. Because men like him always talk too much. They always get sloppy. And they always think no one's watching. So as the music picked back up and the laughter returned in cautious waves, I rejoined the crowd with a calm expression and an unreadable smile. I let Derek come back around later, pretending like nothing had happened, offering me a drink as if we were old friends, not rivals circling each other in a silent war. I played along, because that's how you win in families like mine, not with explosions, but with erosion. Slowly, patiently, quietly, until the whole thing caves in, and no one sees it coming. He had no idea that I knew. And worse, he had no idea what I was going to do with what I knew. There's a certain stillness that settles over a room when someone says the thing everyone else has been too polite, too afraid, or too conditioned to say out loud, a kind of suspended reality where the rules of decorum momentarily collapse. And you can practically hear the collective brain freeze of everyone present as they scramble to decide whether to pretend they didn't hear what they just heard or to acknowledge it and risk becoming part of the fallout. That was the silence that filled the tent after Grandma Lois, with her whiskey sour in one hand and her spine straight as a yardstick, casually dropped the line that detonated Derek's little performance. Is that before or after she closed on her third property? It wasn't shouted, it wasn't bitter, it wasn't even sarcastic, it was worse. It was said with the kind of gentle, precise clarity that turns confidence into embarrassment and applause into awkward throat-clearing. What followed wasn't explosive, not at first. The room didn't erupt into chaos or drama like a bad soap opera. It folded into itself, like a balloon slowly deflating under the weight of something too heavy to float. Derek stood there for a beat too long, his face twitching in that barely perceptible way that only people who've never had to hide their reactions fail to conceal. His smile faltering before he caught himself and forced out a short laugh that sounded far more rehearsed than amused. Aunt Marie's eyes darted toward me, wide with that peculiar mix of confusion and silent disapproval, the kind that says, you weren't supposed to say that out loud, even though I hadn't said anything at all. Uncle Ted, bless his perpetually sunburnt neck, tried to pretend he hadn't heard and muttered something about needing more shrimp cocktail as he wandered toward the buffet table like it was the last lifeboat off a sinking ship. But I didn't move. I stood there, drink in hand, heart calm, eyes steady, letting the tension linger just a little longer, not to punish anyone, not to stir the pot, but because sometimes people need to sit in their discomfort long enough to realize who they've become. And in that moment, surrounded by twinkle lights, cheap wine, and inflated egos, the weight of who I really was and who they had always insisted I wasn't began to shift the balance of power in ways none of them could ignore. I didn't plan to say anything that night. My original intention had been to show up, be polite, endure the usual passive-aggressive commentary about my lifestyle choices, eat a piece of overpriced cake, and leave without making waves. But there's something about a moment like that, a moment when the truth slips into the conversation like a blade between ribs, that changes the entire trajectory of your evening. You either let the moment pass and stay small, or you step forward and remind people that silence has never meant weakness, only strategy. So when Derek, still half laughing, tried to recover with some half-hearted jab about how Jessica's got all kinds of secret hobbies, I tilted my head slightly and, for the first time that evening, let my voice carry. Well, I said, pausing just long enough to let the words settle, if keeping tenants happy, managing 3 roofs, and out-negotiating your favorite mortgage broker counts as a hobby, then sure, let's call it that. I smiled, not the tight, uncomfortable smile I'd worn for years at these events, but a real one, the kind that comes from watching someone realize they've just lost control of the narrative. There was a moment, a delicious, flickering second, when I saw something raw in Derek's eyes. Not rage, not even embarrassment. Something closer to panic. Because for the first time, he understood that I wasn't just the strange cousin who lived alone and brought store-bought dessert to holidays. I was someone who had been playing a different game entirely. And worse, winning. That moment could have been enough. I could have left it there, let the tension dissolve, and gone back to being politely underestimated. But something in me had shifted, something that had been dormant for years, kept under lock and key because I'd been taught that family harmony mattered more than truth, that a woman should be modest even when she's right. That quiet competence is more virtuous than visible success. But standing there, watching the carefully constructed image of Derek begin to splinter under the weight of reality, I realized I didn't owe them quiet anymore. So I lifted my glass and, with the full attention of a room that was still frozen in the aftermath of Grandma's remark, I said, "To Derek and Stacy, may your love be as strong as your credit score and as stable as your last 3 business ventures." There was a pause, a beat, and then one of the groomsmen let out a bark of laughter he tried to muffle with a cough, followed by a few awkward chuckles and one unmistakable gasp from someone near the cake table. Derek tried to laugh again, but it came out jagged, like a zipper catching skin, and Stacy, who until that moment had seemed perfectly content to smile and nod and pose for pictures, turned to him with an expression that could only be described as questioning. Because, you see, it's one thing to be exposed in front of your family, the people who know your stories and your secrets and your flaws. But it's another entirely to be exposed in front of the person you're about to marry, the person who's been fed a sanitized version of you, the highlight reel without the behind-the-scenes footage. That night, I didn't lay all my cards on the table. I didn't tell them everything I knew, or all the ways Derek had cut corners, manipulated numbers, and flattered lenders into risky positions he couldn't back up. I didn't reveal that I'd already made a call earlier that week, purely out of curiosity, to a former colleague who mentioned, almost offhandedly, that Derek's name had come up in an internal discussion about suspicious appraisal reports. No, I didn't say any of that. Because good revenge doesn't come all at once, it comes in pieces, slow and deliberate, like a chess game where your opponent doesn't realize they've been cornered until it's already too late. I left the party shortly after that, not in a huff or with dramatic fanfare, but with quiet confidence, like someone who knows the final act hasn't played yet but already understands how the story ends. I walked past the tent, the laughter trying too hard to sound natural, the conversations bubbling with forced cheer, the tension humming just beneath the surface like a wire pulled too tight. I passed Derek near the valet, his jaw clenched, his fiancée standing a few feet away, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. I didn't speak to him again that night. I didn't need to. The next move was his. But what he didn't realize was that the board had already shifted. The queen was in play. And I was done being a pawn. There's something peculiar, almost poetic, about the way silence settles into people's bones when the truth refuses to be ignored any longer, when all the illusions, the careful performances, the petty power games begin to crack. Not because someone shouted or slammed a door, but because someone chose, with intention and patience, to let reality speak in the one language even arrogance cannot talk: consequence. And that's precisely what had started unfolding in the days after Derek's engagement party, not with some grand revelation or dramatic confrontation in front of the whole family, but with quiet shifts in behavior, subtle changes in tone, and a growing sense of unease that crawled into the corners of every conversation, like smoke after a fire you can't quite find. I hadn't planned for it to happen so quickly. Truthfully, I assumed Derek would do what he always did, which was deflect, deny, and distract, but this time, something was different. Maybe it was Stacy's reaction, the way she looked at him when she thought no one was watching, not with anger exactly, but with a kind of cold assessment, like someone running numbers in her head and realizing the math no longer added up. Or maybe it was the fact that, unlike his usual small-time mistakes, this time there were other players on the board: lenders with compliance departments, appraisers with licenses to protect, and whispers that, once started, couldn't be unspoken. It began with a phone call from a contact I hadn't spoken to in nearly a year, someone who owed me a favor and whose voice, when it came through the receiver, carried the weight of restrained curiosity. "Your cousin Derek," he said, not asking so much as stating, "What's his angle with that commercial strip off Route 31? I played dumb, of course, because in a game like this, the less you admit, the more power you hold, but I knew then that the questions had started making their way through the right rooms. Someone had taken a second look at an appraisal that didn't feel quite right. Someone else had cross-referenced a loan file and found inconsistencies. No one had accused him outright yet, but the scent of something rotten was in the air, and when that scent lingers long enough, it starts attracting attention from people who don't care about family ties or high school football trophies. They care about compliance, liability, and their own reputations. Meanwhile, within the family, the shift was more subtle, more insidious. Aunt Marie's texts became more frequent, but oddly measured, sprinkled with questions that tried to sound casual but reeked of concern. "Everything okay with Derek's new business?" she asked one morning, followed by, "I heard from someone that the bank's asking for extra documentation. Is that normal?" And Uncle Ted, who once dismissed every opinion I ever voiced as overcomplicating things, suddenly took an interest in how you manage your tenants. Do you use a property manager, or do it all yourself? They didn't say it, of course, didn't dare admit they'd been wrong for all those years, but the way they looked at me had changed. Not with admiration, not even with respect, but with wariness. Because once someone proves they're not what you thought, especially when that someone has been in the room the whole time, listening, remembering, calculating, it becomes impossible to pretend you're still in control. But it was Derek's silence that confirmed everything. No follow-up text. No snide comment. No half-hearted apology masked as a joke. Just absence. And in a man like him, silence is never neutral. It's defensive. It's the sound of someone who knows the wind is shifting and isn't sure yet whether to run or rebuild. Still, I didn't press. I didn't push. Because my goal was never to destroy Derek. That would have been too easy, too satisfying in the wrong way. My goal was to reclaim the space he'd tried to steal from me, the respect he'd refused to give, the version of me he'd insisted on presenting to others. And I had done that. Not by shouting over him, not by stooping to his level, but by letting truth, not ego, do the work. And yet, even in that quiet satisfaction, there was something else gnawing at me, something colder, sharper. Because while it felt good to see him squirm, to know that his carefully built tower of cards was beginning to tremble, it also made me question how much of my own energy had been spent waiting for this moment, for this revenge, for this tiny, brilliant flash of vindication. How much of my silence over the years had been strategic, and how much had been fear of being dismissed, of being labeled bitter, of becoming exactly what they always accused women like me of being when we dare to stand alone without apology. In the weeks that followed, I kept moving forward. I closed on a fourth property, a modest but promising triplex in a gentrifying neighborhood with good schools and rising rents. I replaced the old furnace myself after watching 17 hours of YouTube tutorials and cursing in 3 different languages. I helped one of my tenants set up a payment plan after her hours got cut at work. I filed paperwork, drank too much coffee, and sat on the floor one evening with my 2 cats, sorting receipts and wondering if maybe, just maybe, this strange, solitary life I'd built, without champagne toasts or wedding registries or family bragging rights, was the most honest version of success I could have asked for. And yet, part of me still wondered, what happens when you win quietly? When the room finally hears you, but you're already halfway out the door, no longer needing their approval, but not quite free from the shadows of their doubt. That question lingered one night when I got a message, unexpected, brief, and almost pathetic, from Derek. No greeting. No pretense. Just 5 words. Can we talk? It's urgent. I stared at the screen for a long time, longer than I should have, letting the weight of those words settle into my chest, not with panic, not with satisfaction, but with something closer to curiosity. What could he possibly want? An explanation? Forgiveness? Help? Was this his way of admitting that he had finally fallen into the pit he dug so recklessly? Or was it just another performance, another attempt to spin his way back into control? I didn't reply. Not that night. Not the next. Because the truth was, I didn't know yet what kind of ending I wanted. Did I want closure, or did I want silence? Did I want him to suffer, or to learn? Did I even believe he could? These are the things no one tells you about revenge. That it doesn't always come with applause. That it doesn't fix the years of shrinking yourself, of biting your tongue, of watching someone else take the credit while you did the work in the dark. That sometimes, the most satisfying victories leave you staring into the mirror, asking yourself if you've really won, or just survived a little smarter. And maybe that's the point. Maybe this story was never about Derek. Maybe it was about deciding who I was, without their noise in my ear. About learning that power doesn't always announce itself, and that strength often looks like walking away before the applause starts. Or maybe I'm just giving myself too much credit. Either way, I never answered that message. Because some questions deserve to stay unanswered. And some games, once won, don't need to be played again.